And we are live. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, for being here, for creating time and space to be here with us. It is an important topic. It is an important topic for me. It is an important topic for my guest today, CIPHR. I will allow CIPHR to introduce herself in just a moment. But yeah, just welcoming everyone in. We'll give people another few seconds to get in. We already are getting hellos. Hi, Nadej. Thank you for being here. Nadej saying hello, ladies. Yeah, everyone say hi to us. Where are you dialing in from? And this is a bit of a different kind of live than what I have done before, where it's more of a kind of like an interview style, and I'm kind of tapping into the other person's zone of genius, so to say, which I'm going to be doing today with CIPHR as well. But this will be a much more open conversation. This is a much more open forum today than before. That's what AMA is about. So AMA, for those who might not know, stands for Ask Me Anything. And today, Ask Me Anything about burnout. So as many of you know, and some of you have joined my sessions before, I've talked about burnout. I've shared stuff about burnout just because it's a very personal journey for me. It has been. I'm an expert in burnout. And what I mean by that is I'm an expert in my own personal burnout, but burnout comes in different shapes and sizes. And we kind of like want to honor the full conversation in today's session. So I will be putting my expert hat on with my expertise in my personal burnout, but that's the reason why I brought here CIPHR, who is an actual accredited, certified burnout prevention coach. She works with organizations, she works with corporate places, and also with individuals in preventing burnout, because she has a very, again, personal, very deep-rooted conversation story about what burnout has meant for her, and I'll allow her to tell her story in just a moment. Just want to say hello to everyone who's already here. And just a reminder, our chat section or the comment section is going to be open and monitored throughout the session, so feel free to ask your questions in there. Ask me anything. Share your thoughts, share your reflections about the things that we are going through. We already have some questions that have been sent over to us privately. So those questions, we won't be sharing the names, we won't be sharing any identifiers for people. We'll just be treating them as general questions, and we'll be talking about those. So CIPHR, I shall open the stage up to you. I'll take a breath and open the stage up for you. Please tell us your story.
Good afternoon. So my name is CIPHR Jones, also known as the Corporate Hippie, and as Biba said, I am a corporate burnout prevention consultant as well as certified lifestyle coach. I help high-performing professionals achieve sustainable success, perform at full potential, all without the threat of burnout, so they can pursue their professional aspirations without sacrificing their personal health and vitality, because that was my experience. So I am an ex-investment analyst and former stress addict. Former stress addict in that I still thrive underneath tight deadlines and have to remind myself you don't need to live a high-stress lifestyle. And oftentimes, a lot of high performers are great at utilising stress to excel in their relative areas of expertise. But because they're so good at utilising stress, they also get accustomed to the adrenaline rush, the adrenaline hits that come along with stress, the dopamine rush that comes along with making the seemingly impossible attainable, and being unable to identify if they actually do live a high-stress lifestyle. And burnout is the chronic exposure to stress, or it's the result of the chronic exposure to stress. So in my own personal life, being an ex-investment analyst, early into my career as an analyst, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a debilitating, disabling autoimmune condition. And for me, that was my final burnout. But the truth is, my burnout cycle, which I had been living in for 4 years, started way before I joined the corporate world. So my final year of studying economics, I completed a 10,000 words first-class socio-econometric dissertation in 48 hours, handed in 1 minute before the deadline with my mum in a coma. And so I knew, I really thrive underneath a tight deadline in extreme circumstances, because that adrenaline rush is a natural performance-enhancing drug. And I am not alone in feeling that way. A lot of corporate professionals, a lot of high performers feel exactly that. However, the issue was I was so accustomed to living a high-stress lifestyle. I did not see those signs. I did not feel the warning effects. And I thought actually it was quite normal to do so. So that continued the year after I graduated, not ready to join the real world. I decided I was going to waitress. So it, afforded me the flexibility to visit my mum, who was severely neurologically disabled, paraplegic and blind, as well as supplement my income as a, young 20-year-old in London. I worked so hard that I almost died on my 23rd birthday, spent a week in hospital fighting off sepsis because, for the ladies in the room, a condition that's normally cured by cranberry juice had brought me to the door of sepsis because I had just overworked myself. Bearing in mind, during that time, I was also working as a research and policy volunteer for the Fair Trade Foundation because I thought I wanted to be an economist. I was wrong. The year after that, I survived 7 days in hospital, but we're here. The year after that, I had a lot of pressure from family members asking when I was going to put my good degree to some use because waitressing and volunteering just wasn't cutting it anymore. Bearing in mind, my mum was still incredibly ill. So I gave into the pressure of it. And I received a call from a top 2 investment consultancy asking if I wanted to interview. I begrudgingly said yes, because I guess it was time for me to join the real world. But unfortunately, suddenly, but peacefully, my mum passed away the day after my birthday. So I had a bit of a compromise to make, and I decided that I was going to bury my mum on the Thursday and start my first investment job 4 days after on the Monday, which I recommend to no one. I created this perfect work-life balance. But within 18 months of creating this perfect work-life balance, I was sat in front of a consultant being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And it was at that moment I realised there's a huge misconception about stress management. There's a huge misconception around burnout, and I needed to make a change. So I created the burnout-free lifestyle so I could regain control of both my life, my career, but most importantly, my health. And now, actually, this month is 3 years, is my 3-year anniversary of being symptom-free, relapse and episode-free of MS without any medical intervention, purely by creating a burnout-free lifestyle. So yeah, that's my little intro. Thanks, Barbara.
Sapphira, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, so much of that spoke to my soul in terms of some of the things that you went through, how you were quote unquote blind to the symptoms when they were staring in your face. And how, we, the high achievers, the A-type players, we, yes, it is a social issue. Burnout is a social issue, but we co-create those conditions for us. And those high achievers who are here right now, who might be watching in replay, we are talking to you because we are high achievers. And here we are sharing our very raw, real experiences because we are the ones who are most susceptible, kind of like at most danger to burn out and get that potentially even diagnosed with something much more serious than that. So Sapphira, thank you so much for sharing it. So thank you for setting the scene, and I couldn't imagine a better person to have this conversation with. And so once again, to everyone and anyone who might be joining us or may have joined us just now, the chat box, the comments box is open. Please engage with us. This is an AMA or Ask Me Anything session. This is an open forum. We want to hear from you, your thoughts, reflections, or any questions that you might have about burnout. And I want to kind of get straight into it because we have so many questions that have already been sent through and just kind of want to get through them. But at the same time, when it comes to burnout, we are not here just because we have been through it. We have been through a mental illness crisis for a while, not just before pandemic simply triggered it. We have been running in cycles of burnout and anxiety and stress and overwhelm for far too long. When I went into my burnout, it wasn't because one thing triggered. Yeah, one thing triggered it, but one thing didn't cause it. It was years of stuff that's been piled on my nervous system, and my nervous system just broke. And so, and like I said, this is not just, our experience. As I shared in the post, in this live post, ahead of this session, there are a number of research that's been done around this, and it is a real crisis. According to Westfield Health, nearly half of UK workforce is close to burnout. 79% of British adults and 90% of 18 to 24-year-olds experience high levels of stress day in, day out. 42% of the UK this year in 2022 are feeling more exhausted than ever. And we are talking about being over or on the other side of pandemic. We are feeling more exhausted than ever because we haven't created space for ourselves to heal and to process what has happened to us during the pandemic. And not just pandemic, but everything, all the other fires and all the other bombs that have been, thrown at us. Glassdoor analysed more than 300,000 employee reviews, and this research revealed that burnout among British workers increased by 48%, so nearly by 50% between 21 and 2022. In a year, nearly by 50%. And National Institute of Health and Care Excellence estimated that 13.7 million workdays are lost every single year in the UK alone due to work-related stress, and that accounts to nearly 30 billion in lost productivity. I mean, this is not just a personal problem, it's a social problem, it's a workplace problem, it costs money, it costs lives, ultimately, and hence it is important to talk about it.
Without a doubt, people don't realise as well that in 2019, before we even knew what coronavirus was, 54% of working days were lost to stress-related ill health. So that's any ill health, both mentally, physically, that's exacerbated or triggered by stress. And that increased to 84% by 2021 alone. So it's definitely been an existing problem long before we knew what a pandemic or national lockdown even looks like. I think one of the biggest turning points is that the things people tend to use for escapism, things like that I utilize myself, like going on holiday or going out with the girls, it just wasn't an option anymore. So people were faced with the reality that actually maybe they're not living a lifestyle that's conducive to their health and well-being. And so the pandemic, particularly national lockdown, really was both an incubator and amplifier. So any existing issues or any existing problems or worries that were there were simply incubated and then amplified by being in a national lockdown.
Absolutely, we've always had it. The high achievers more than others potentially, and so here we are talking about it. And so I feel that potentially a good place where to start this conversation. We kind of have already covered some ground about burnout, but perhaps it's good to start with just kind of light touch defining of what burnout is. I think many people already know or have an idea of what it is, but just to make sure that we all kind of like show up in this space from the same kind of page or on the same playing field. And so when it comes to burnout, you know, WHO or the World Health Organization has defined burnout as an occupational phenomenon that is created by prolonged stress. I am happy and I'm glad that WHO or World Health Organization has finally acknowledged this, although burnout is still not necessarily treated as mental illness, but is treated as mental well-being problem. But yeah, so this kind of occupational phenomenon, I think, is only one part of the story, and burnout is much more pervasive than that. And I guess, you know, we talk about burnout in this capacity just because of how much time we spend working, and just because of how much time and you know how much of that stress comes from workplaces, but not necessarily burnout is only and solely a workplace phenomenon. And CIPHR, I would love to hear, you know, your thoughts on burnout and you know, when you work with it, what's kind of your definition of it?
So I vehemently disagree with the World Health Organization that burnout is an occupational phenomenon. Burnout is simply the result of chronic exposure to stress, which means you're experiencing exhaustion, whether that be mentally, physically, or emotionally. So the reason why I give my story to people is because my burnout cycle started long before I joined the corporate world. It was the fact that I was living in a high stress lifestyle of chronic triggers, and I didn't have the tools in order to navigate that what life had thrown at me at that point in time. So it's not an occupational phenomenon. But as you say, we spend a lot of our waking lives at work. At one point, people would say we spend 40 hours. That's definitely increased since the hybrid world, where people may not even take sick days anymore. They're just working from home whilst being sick, because technically you can still see the screen, right? But I think the reason why it gets called an occupational phenomenon is because also at work, it's the most quantifiable part of our lives. It's the part of our lives where we are constantly measured. It's easy to measure the performance. It's easy to see how well we're doing, which you generally don't get in your personal life. So it feels like it's an occupational phenomenon because you'll see measurably that maybe your performance has decreased at work. But your performance probably decreased at work because your capacity to manage stress, your capacity to function has been so greatly affected that you're not actually measuring how many times have you gone to bed without doing the dishes, how many times have you woken up and left the house without making up your bed, which is all part of functioning, but no one's measuring that, and it's not something you tend to take into consideration because you're also not being paid for it. So it often gets misinterpreted as an occupational phenomenon for that reason alone. But burnout is truly the chronic exposure to stress, or the result of chronic exposure to stress, And that stress can be in your personal or your professional life. Stress is stress. In fact, stress is just like fire. If it's well managed, if it's well utilized, it can be productive, it can be constructive. But if it's mismanaged, misutilized, or worse, you don't even know it exists, then just like fire, stress has the potential to be catastrophic and disastrous. So in effect, great way to look at burnout is like your house on fire, is on fire. So the more stress you have in your life, the more it's going to become out of control and the harder it is to contain and then eventually put out. So the ultimate result is that your house is on fire, i.e. you've burnt out.
As simple as that. As simple as that. Thank you, Sapira. And right, don't overcomplicate it. And I absolutely agree with you about, I guess, workplaces are the spaces where burnout has kind of been placed into just because it's measurable. We can talk about it in terms of money, productivity, lost sick days, how much it's costing our economies, our work places, and so on. But you're absolutely right. And, from your story, alone, it's clear that, chronic stress is like coping with illness, school, you're providing care for, children or older adults, young moms burn out because, again, there's not appropriate support for them postpartum. And often these communities, when in a conversation about burnout, are being lost or are being made invisible. Marginalized communities, be they in workforce or be they are anywhere else, they're made invisible in this conversation if we only talk about burnout as a workforce or occupational phenomenon.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and so and ultimately, as you talked about stress, it is about these stresses, these experiences that just compound, pile up on our nervous system until our nervous system breaks. And I loved, pardon?
I said without a doubt, because I think people forget that when you do experience stress, your body goes into fight or flight. And if you go into fight or flight, then it kicks in the adrenaline, which is a stress hormone response. And adrenaline will suppress your immune system. So your immune system is unable to function at its optimal level, which is why a lot of people find that when it does come time to take annual leave and go on holiday, they might get sick just before they go on holiday or just in the first few days of their holiday. And that's because their body knows it's no longer in fight or flight, theoretically. So the adrenaline decreases, it wants to switch the immune system back on because the cortisol, the relaxation hormone, has increased. And then you're left at this really vulnerable point. But if you're constantly in a state of fight or flight because of chronic exposure to stress, your immune system goes haywire. So people like myself end up being diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, which is simply showing that our immune system has been greatly compromised.
And you very nicely alluded into one of the other questions that has been sent in around kind of recognizing burnout in yourself. And I think, again, this is one of those things that we have lists and lists and piles of information about what burnout looks like. This is what you might feel like. But not necessarily it's that easy to kind of like tick off all of those boxes, or those boxes are so general that it could be anything. You might be hungry and you fit into burnout box anyway. So let's talk about how do you start paying attention to those triggers, to those warning signs, those early warning signs, and start recognizing burnout in yourself.
Honestly, it's incredibly difficult because burnout is a creeper condition in nature. Oftentimes you don't realize you're burnt out until you're already burnt out, which is why I believe prevention is better than cure. It's something my grandma would always say when it comes to burnout. It most definitely is the key. But then also, if you're a high performer who's in the thick of things, you might just overlook the importance of your well-being. So, for example, when I said I had a perfect work-life balance, part of that was I was predominantly plant-based, so my nutrition was impeccable. I went to the gym 6 times a week, sometimes twice a day, which sounds great, but actually it's a bit excessive. So I was also physically burning myself out. But I also wasn't sleeping. But I thought that getting 3 to 4 non-consecutive hours of sleep a night was fine because I've been functioning like that for 10 years whilst achieving. So sometimes we end up making things our norm, or we just completely neglect the warning signs. So I went to bed with the flu back in 2018 and woke up the next morning and couldn't feel anything below my hips, which is the start of me experiencing MS. And I thought, well, that's a bit unusual, but I didn't go and get it checked out. I sort of just carried on. It wasn't until I lost my eyesight, and again, you think that would be a warning signal, but it wasn't. It was my priority was I need a holiday. It's been a long reporting season. I need to go on holiday. And I knew if I didn't go into hospital to find out if the blindness was due to pressure, I wouldn't be safe to fly. So oftentimes, because it looks so different for different people and there's such a mirage of symptoms, prevention is often better than cure, and knowing how to appropriately prevent it. But oftentimes, one of the key indicators is if you become disenfranchised, disillusioned, and you feel like you no longer have a purpose, or you are fighting yourself to do the small menial task. Oftentimes, if you're experiencing that, you're already in burnout.
Yes, those and kind of like those stories that we're telling ourselves around, I don't have enough time for this. I don't have enough energy I don't have enough time to relax. I have too much on my plate. I don't have enough energy to spend time with my children. And it's like this not enough, I think, is at least kind of like from my experience of my own burnout. That was definitely, one of those things which I absolutely ignored. And Nadej is also reflecting. She's saying that listening to our bodies is really, really key. It helped her to recognize she had burnout. And thank you for sharing, Nadej. And I think our ability to even listen to our body needs to improve. First and foremost, our vocabulary about what we are feeling needs to improve. Because and I've shared it a ton of times, and I'll share it more, just to say that there is research. Brene Brown and her research did this piece around asking 17,000 leaders about naming and recognizing and naming their emotions. The average number of emotions, and kind of the average number of emotions right out there right now is about 30, give or take. Mm-hmm. The average number of emotions that these 17,000 leaders could name were 3: angry, sad, unhappy.
But sometimes there's a luxury in being able to recognize your feelings or listen to your body, because those people who tend to be burning out are in fight or flight, so they're in survival mode. They don't have the capacity. So imagine if you are in survival mode and sirens are constantly going off. How do you differentiate between the external sirens and the internal sirens? So it's not oftentimes a willful neglect, it's they don't have the capacity because they are burnt out. And so it's really interesting, because once you're no longer in survival mode, you do then have the space, the luxury to start healing, to start understanding yourself, to start articulating what's going on. But if you are in constant firefighting mode, you're fighting those fires, you're in survival mode and you don't have that, which is why it's really important to know how to effectively prevent burnout. Because actually what it takes to prevent burnout is the same thing it takes to recover from burnout. The difference is how much energy you have. When you're preventing burnout, you tend to have more energy because you haven't already burnt out. But if you're recovering from burnout, it's because you've already expended your energy. So you have to sort of dig a little deeper or get help and assistance in coming back. But you can do both. But then you have to have a capacity to be able to hear your body in the first place, which is a great thing to do. But as I said, burnout's a creeper. So when people are already in it, that ability to recognize how they feel, to articulate that, and to hear what their body's telling them is often already depleted.
You're absolutely right. It's not existent because you are in that freeze mode. Your body is hibernating. It's containing. It's trying to survive. Right. You're absolutely right. When it comes to kind of like listening to your body, when it comes to this kind of vocabulary, that is absolutely either the preventative piece if you don't want to get into the burnout. That is one of the first and one of the greatest tools. And also, as you said, when you're already on the other side and you're like, I don't want to go back there anymore, what are some of the things that I need to do? And burnout was one of my biggest teachers. What was one of my greatest lessons learned. I have 360% or degree completely different relationship with my body, different conversations that I'm having with my mind and with my body, different, I get the triggers. And also what Nadej said about listening to our body. Like one of the things that when I was in burnout, I remember I could not look at my laptop. I could not look, and it's not just like I couldn't look at the screen or I couldn't do the work, which absolutely you can't do the work. I could not look at my laptop. I had to hide my laptop because it made me sick. Physically, my body was reacting to doing another thing, to creating another thing, because all of that work happened on the screen, because that was right in the middle of the burnout. Sorry, right in the middle of pandemic, where everything was kind of like 100% virtual. And I just remember in the first stint for 2 weeks straight, I had to hide my laptop. So it was completely away from my side because it made me physically sick. And afterwards, I reintroduced laptop and screens back into my diet by having, a few minutes there and then only doing kind of like the most important things that I needed. But yeah, and then, and that's when I started getting curious. What is this? Why am I reacting to something that I have been doing for, over a decade? What is it? And you do start getting curious about what is that I'm experiencing right now.
Curiosity is important because I would tell everyone that I'm grateful that I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. That for me was the ultimate burnout. And the turning point was like, right, I have to get out of this cycle. This is ridiculous. I've achieved so many great things, but it's come at such a huge cost. And the curiosity propelled me to ask my consultant, where did I go wrong? And he said, well, you haven't. You've created like a great work-life balance. It just happens to some people. But me being the analyst that I am, knew those numbers just didn't add up. Clearly, something had to have gone awry here. You don't just get diagnosed with MS in your early 20s if you've got this perfect work-life balance. And then I remember the conversation I had with one of my econometric lecturers years ago, final year of uni. He knew my mum was in a coma and I was heading into a lab session. And he said to me, hey, Sabira, how are you managing? And me trying to keep things light and breezy because I just wanted to get on with my work, I went to him, I'm not, but I'm coping. But remembering that conversation, 5 years on, being diagnosed with MS was the game changer for me. So many people are good at coping with stress, but they don't really know how to manage stress. And that's because it's a huge misconception. We're often told that coping with stress is getting a good night's sleep, eating a good meal, going to the gym, going for a walk in nature, even bringing puppies into the office. But that's not managing stress at all. That's coping with stress. So if we go back to the whole idea that stress is like fire, but imagine your house was on fire. Like you've reached burnout. So your house is on fire and you call the fire brigade and they say, hey, Barbara, I can't make it right now, but could you please just breathe in and breathe out? Two things are going to happen. Number one, you're going to be incredibly annoyed because they haven't provided you with a solution. Your house is still on fire. And number two, your house is still on fire. So coping with stress, they're great tools to have for stress relief, not stress management. Real stress management is being able to correctly identify the fires and put them out. And the fires really are the unnecessary stress, the stress that's counterproductive, the stress that's disastrous, catastrophic, because it's either taking you away from your goals, it's causing you harm, or you're not even aware they're going on. So coping with stress is like knowing how to swim. It is an essential life-saving skill to have. Problem is, with high performers, they're so good at swimming that eventually when they do get tired, they start treading water. People don't realize they're drowning until it's too late. Whereas managing stress, being able to effectively identify and put out those fires, is like knowing how to surf. And life is a lot more like an ocean than it is a swimming pool. If you know how to surf, you don't have to worry about trying to control the tides, which we know we can't. You have to worry about what's in the water, and oftentimes we can't see what's in the water around us. But what you do have is the confidence, the expertise, and the tools to navigate those waves and even yet enjoy the ride. So oftentimes what we're taught as stress management is actually ineffective because they're not putting out their fires. They're not increasing our capacity to manage the stress. They're just providing relief. And if you provide relief, it may feel great for a moment. Bearing in mind, I love meditation. I love working out. I love a good diet. It feels great for the moment, but it doesn't stop you from being exposed to chronic stress. And that's the issue, which means you need to eliminate the stress in order to erase the exposure to it. So I'll say to people as well, like, imagine you've been locked in a room, it's beautiful, it's tranquil, and someone tells you to just take a break, just rest, because I know you've been stressed. But the problem is, each of the stress in your life is represented by a wasp. Biba, how much are you going to be able to relax and unwind in a room full of wasps? It's It's incredibly hard to rest when you're incredibly stressed. So the goal is to eliminate the unnecessary stress in your life, to naturally increase your capacity to manage the stress you do need, which enables you to excel in your relative areas of expertise, but also start creating and be solution focused and designing the life that you need that's conducive to your health and well-being.
I mean, I think this deserves an amen here. That was beautiful. And thank you so much for talking about coping mechanisms and actually managing stress. And this has resonated with a lot of people now. They're saying, thank you for calling that out, because coping and managing, they are not the same thing. And often, these yoga classes and meditations as the kind of one paracetamol, pill, like one size fits all, is here is one for your burnout, here's one for your anxiety, here's one for your depression. Unfortunately, they are great for coping in the moment, reducing anxiety symptoms, but they are not for the, so they are not what will sort out the root cause.
100%.
They will
It's
provide the relief.
symptomatic. It's symptomatic. They're short-term strategies. They're well placed for certain things. So there was one time when I was first having MS symptoms, I was commuting to London Victoria. By the time I got to my local train station, I couldn't really feel my legs. So I decided to meditate on my commute. There's about 15 minutes of meditation. By the time the train pulled into Victoria, I'd be able to regain control of my legs because the anxiety and the stress had been released. My immune system had been somewhat reset, which enabled me to find that strength. But it didn't eliminate the things that were occurring in my life, which was contributing to the compounded effect of burnout. So they are well placed, but they aren't to be conflated.
No, and you're absolutely right. And you reminded me, last month I was in London. I hadn't been in London for 2.5 years. And I went back or maybe 2 years, who knows anymore. And I went and I had to go to this summit, to this conference. And I was traveling from Wimbledon to King's Cross, I think I was traveling to. And it's about half an hour's underground ride. And I had not been on underground. And I used to live in London. I used to go on underground every single day. Waterloo, London Bridge, bring it on, right? Right now, I got on the train, and at the Wimbledon, it was like a few people. But as you get closer to the city centre, more and more people come in. And you're sitting there, and it's like a sausage. Many people are, coming in, kind of leaning over you. They're in your space. They're in your energy zone. And I just started having my kind of like panics/anxiety attack symptoms where I'm like, okay, this does not feel good. And I'm similar as you, through breathing exercises, through, meditation, that helped me. It helped me get through that journey. But that also made me get curious about, okay, what is happening right now in my life in general that is creating this? Yeah, this train ride potentially has triggered it, because I not necessarily am used to any more too crowded areas that used to be second nature to me. That's just a trigger. But what is happening right now that has tensed me up so much that these things trigger me?
100%. And exactly that. So like for myself personally, I use MS as a superpower. It's my own personal barometer. If I start to feel anything that even resembles a symptom, I know personally I've been triggered. The level of stress, and my stress container, for lack of a better term, is almost full to the brink. So oftentimes when we're triggered by things, it's either because our capacity is reaching its maximum, or as you said, there's a root cause that's manifesting itself in that particular external thing, but it's not actually the case. So even when I work with people, I do, even though I'm coaching them to create their own burnout-free lifestyle, I encourage them to go to therapy, because I think we've underestimated the importance of therapy. Therapy is for people who don't want to have problems, not just for people who may already have problems. And it's often things like that, like actually, what is it about being outside that's triggering me? Where does that come from? And you have to be curious. Anyone who is solution focused, anyone who wants to create change, generally speaking, are curious by nature, and that level of curiosity will save you. They say that kill the cat, but I promise you it will save your health and your career.
I love that. And a lot of people connected with your metaphor of surfing. The love that you use, kind of like swimming in a pool and actually going surfing in the ocean, two very different things.
Absolutely.
And Jimena, and I do apologize if I've absolutely butchered your name, is saying that we often use defense mechanisms as coping mechanisms and never learn how to manage. That's word.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And so, we've talked about kind of individual symptoms and shared some of our experiences, but some of our people who have asked the questions, there has been kind of the flip side of it as well. Not necessarily the flip side, but kind of like going from individual to a workplace environment and how to recognize that the workplace, the job that you are in, is facilitating burnout. What about the environment that are some of those red flag, red flag, red flag?
That's a really great question to ask, because oftentimes it's the culture, not necessarily the work. So, for example, if you're someone who doesn't work well with micromanagement, then if you do have a manager who's constantly micromanaging, constantly maybe potentially potentially bullying you, then that will contribute to how much worth you see and value you see in yourself and the work you do. If you're someone who has a protected characteristic and your organization just doesn't have an inclusive culture, then that's going to contribute to burnout, because if you don't have an inclusive culture, by default you have a hostile environment and no one thrives in hostility. And furthermore, if you have a culture who just doesn't understand the importance of the people within their organization, it's a problem, because an organization is only as successful as the talent it can retain or the talent it hires. And if it's doing nothing to invest in its people outside of helping them maybe climb the career ladder through skills such as presenting and CV writing, and not actually investing in people to say, actually, how do we increase the level of sustainability, the social impact, then there's potentially an issue. But in all honesty, whilst workplaces can contribute to burnout, the most important thing people can do is to create that level of prevention in their own world, because then when you do so, it increases your confidence. So you then disassociate your self-worth and value with your role or with the work you produce. So when you do get feedback, whether that's been clumsily done by managers who need some training still, or whether it's just constructive criticism in general, you're not going to then internalize that and take it personally, because you understand what you do is not who you are. If you have people in a workplace who you may not necessarily get along with, if you have that level of preventativeness outside of work and you have a clear, strong foundation of who you are, and your stress container is not already at max, their influence on you is not going to be so great. But we do know that there are some cultures, and I've experienced it personally myself, where they genuinely are abusive, not toxic, but abusive. I think toxic is when there's just not a real emphasis or acknowledgement of the importance of investing in people as people. But then we have environments where they are abusive, because we've got people in management who shouldn't be in a management position because they actually don't have the interpersonal skill set to fulfill that role. They may be good at the particular job, but they may not be good with people. So I think it's important to be able to differentiate what's toxic and what's abusive. Abusive should not be stood for. Those people need to be reprimanded and looked at, and zero tolerance policy needs to be put into effect. Toxic workplace culture, sometimes it could be our own sensitivity to that culture, and we may need to look in ourselves and make sure it's not a trigger that we're projecting outwardly. So I think there is a difference between toxic and abusive workplace cultures.
I totally agree with you, absolutely. And sometimes it, again, might be difficult to tell them apart, but there is a difference when you look close enough. And the thing about, workplaces that you kind of like made me think about as well, because there are people who are saying, but I can't, set boundaries because I have to, say yes, because otherwise I'm not going to get to the next promotion, or they're going to take me off of this, big project. And that's real story. These are not things that people are imagining. It is real story. And that's, that comes with those, toxic cultures and borderline abusive cultures ultimately.
They are real stories, Viber, but I'll challenge that in the sense that if you empower yourself, if you take back your personal power, you can navigate that. So, for example, we see it particularly those with protected characteristics, particularly let's call it non-white professionals who may call out racism, or they may not call out racism out of fear of being blackballed further on, professional ramifications and repercussions for doing so. They are very real stories. But one way that you can mitigate that to an extent is to build your own professional brand, to build your credibility and how you're seen in the world, because it transforms you from being another number on payroll to actually a valued member of that organization. So it's easier for you to then implement your boundaries. It's easier for you to say no and to really take the time and reflect to say, actually, what work would I take on, which would I not? And actually, sometimes when will I fall on my sword, because actually it's not affecting my ego. It's just part and parcel of navigating this particular terrain. So they are very real. I myself have experienced them so bad that actually an employment tribunal case was open because of how abusive the workplace culture was. But what enabled us to go through that without burning out was being able to understand what value do I bring to that organization and being confident in that by creating a professional brand, by being able to see my own credibility and in the work that I do, but also not associating what I do with who I am, understanding that they are different things. So they're very real. They're not imagined whatsoever, but there are still ways that we can overcome that by taking back our personal power and increasing our capacity to manage those types of stresses, because they exist. But as long as your stress container is not at full, as long as you have capacity, you can navigate that in an empowered way without being triggered or burnt out. You might get burnt by the situation because you're human, but you won't get burnt out by the situation.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it was, I can't remember what I was reading. I think it was somewhere on LinkedIn, just talking about kind of this toxic hustle culture that's still heavily promoted across the board, but especially in the US. And there was these kind of like two pictures about these two self-made billionaires who are basically sleeping in their offices, and that's seen as they are more committed than anyone else, and that's why they deserve being, on the billionaire list or millionaire list, whatever. And there's someone who in the comments had written, and I'm not going to specifically remember what the terms were, but she was talking about the boundaries that kind of are the things that we are setting within ourselves, and some of the things that you've talked about. And the other thing was, I'm going to call them barriers, but I don't think that was the term. But ultimately, what she talked about there is like what are the things that the organization sets to ensure that its employees do not burn out. Things like making sure that people do take annual leave, that they do not sit in the office or at their laptop past those working hours. They're not emails sent at like odd times unless that's something that has been agreed because of care duties and those kinds of things. But what are the things that organizations do to ensure, how do they capture, if they can capture data about sick leaves and sick days and how much money they lose, how do they capture what's happening within their culture, and are they facilitating through bad people management, bad practices, bad policies, burnout? Because there's one thing that we can absolutely do within ourselves, but then again, it's kind of the organizational piece that not necessarily is designed for that.
So this is why I work as a corporate burnout prevention consultant, because it has to be a two-pronged approach. Because on one hand, I work with individuals, people to help them create a burnout-free lifestyle. I definitely work with line managers because I feel like they get a bad rep for being the frozen middle, but actually they can be the gateway of the entire organization if they're not burnt out themselves. Because how much easier would it be to put out the fire in someone else's house when your own house is on fire? But at the same time, no matter how much organizations strive to implement policies to ensure people take annual leave, to give them well-being weeks, if your people themselves don't have those boundaries installed, they're likely to still work during their annual leave. They're likely to be sitting there in a room full of wasps, trying to relax, knowing full well they can't relax because they're thinking about the inbox when they get back to work. They're thinking about the project they haven't quite finished yet, or worrying about someone's notice that their performance may be slipping, and their performance may not be slipping, but because they don't feel great in themselves, they've projected that onto other people. So I believe in taking a two-pronged approach. You absolutely need to have a workplace culture that is preventative of burnout, in that it's inclusive and it's holistic. But we also need to ensure that the people within that organization, if you're giving them the tools in order to work in that manner are empowered enough to pick up them tools and utilize them. So it has to be a two-pronged approach. A lot of organizations have given their people a well-being week. We're closing for a week. We've seen it with Bumble, we saw it with Nike, we've seen it with Spotify. But actually, how are those people using that time? Because a lot of people are working on the weekends. And even though the post does show about the hustle culture and how that has been glorified and glamorized for however long, Taylor's oldest time, there are a lot of people who are working on the weekends but keeping it secret because they're ashamed. Because in their head, they're thinking, I need to do the work on the weekends or late into the evenings to catch up, to be seen as being on top of their stuff. So even though they may not be wearing it as a badge of honor, it's a badge of shame, they're still doing it. So it has to go hand in hand. So we're empowering people to work in that fashion, but we're also, from an organizational standpoint, modeling the type of behavior we want to see, especially by line managers doing the same thing. So I'll tell line managers, if you're booking meetings, maybe try booking a meeting 5 minutes past the hour. Doesn't have to be a meeting. Can you cut that hour meeting down to 45 minutes to give people back time in their diary so they're not jumping from meeting to meeting and then trying to work on the deliverables outside of the office hours because they spent the entire office day in virtual meetings? It can also be a case of, okay, well, if for whatever reason you are working outside of your scheduled time because you may have taken time off throughout the day, to schedule those emails to come in at 9:30, not 9 a.m., because 9 a.m. people may be thinking I need to be there ready to go and respond because the emails come in 9 on the dot. But maybe 9:30, give people a chance to breathe, give people a chance to organize their day and take control of their day before the day even begins when they turn on their laptops. So it's definitely a twofold approach that needs to be taken.
Absolutely. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about also the next question. And this is one of my favorite questions that we received. And I definitely want to touch on this. Does burnout only happen at bad times?
No.
Let's talk about this.
There are different
big
types
fat
of
no from me as well. Yeah.
What's that?
It's a big fat no from me as well to this question.
If you just take it back to its simple definition, burnout is a result of chronic exposure to stress. You can have good stress as well as bad stress. What defines the two is oftentimes the outcome of the stressful situation. So if we think about Olympians, for example, my mum was so bitterly disappointed that I did not, inherit her athletic talents. But if we think about Olympians, if we think about athletes, that's a very stressful situation they're in. Fair enough, it's during a confined amount of time. They start the race. If we think about sprinters, there's usually less than 10 seconds. But that moment in time is incredibly stressful. The period of training around it is incredibly stressful. When they win, it's an amazing euphoric feeling, I imagine. I'm not an Olympian. But the process to that was incredibly stressful, and they could end up physically burning themselves out or mentally and emotionally burning themselves out because of the amount of pressure they put under, even though it's due to a great cause and a great outcome. People can also be emotionally triggered by exciting situations. Like for example, you think about someone with asthma, they could be in a great moment, very exciting, but that emotional stress can trigger an asthma attack. We just need to look at the basic definition of burnout. It's a chronic exposure to stress. So that stress can be great or it could be despair, but it's still stress. Your body's still going to experience it the same way. It's the same physiological effects that's happening at fight or flight response. What changes is, as I said, it's our perception or the outcome of that moment. But stress is stress. Stress is fire.
Stress is fire. And I totally agree with you that no, burnout is not reserved just for bad times. That, just from my own experience as well, this has happened to many business owners, when their business performance or their personal performance is at its peak is when they break down with burnout. I've had that, when I went down with my burnout in, I don't even remember when anymore, 2020, 2020, I think it was. That was it. It was, I felt that I was on top of the world. I was having my best year yet. And, one of my best friends as well, who I work very closely with as well, to this day, she says that when she came down with burnout in 2019, it was her best year yet. And she kind of, at this point that she's still recovering, is kind of like looking at that year and kind of asking herself, what happened? It was my best year yet. How do I get back to it? So no, absolutely, burnout is not reserved just for bad times. whether, as you already told, whether experiencing prolonged or excessive stress because your business or company isn't doing well, it can also happen when you are at your peak, because there's so much prime, powerful energy going into that it can lead us to a brink of burnout ultimately. Because it also is lack of rest, isn't it?
So again, that's a perfect point to make, because I think this question is a good time to highlight there's a difference between feeling run down and feeling burnt out. And sometimes people conflate the two as well. You can get run down without necessarily burning out. So imagine you have a car, you've gone on a long journey. After a period of time, you need to stop and you need to either refuel the car or recharge the car, because it can only go for so long. That's natural. You've taken the car on a long journey. It needs refueling. That's being run down. So if you've been working at a high level for a long period of time, and you haven't maybe necessarily paced yourself or been getting adequate rest in between, you can end up being run down. However, imagine a car, you've gone on a long journey, you stop to refuel, recharge it, but for whatever reason, that car still won't start up. You put all the fuel in it, you've recharged it, the car still won't start up. That's burnout. It's not a case of getting rest and relaxation. Burnout can't be cured with rest and relaxation. Being run down can. When you experience burnout, the issue is you lose a sense of agency. You feel like you no longer have control over your life. So no matter what you do, it's to no effect. When you're experiencing burnout, you lose sense of purpose. So imagine burnout being like your world is bleak and black and you can't see your hand in front of your own face. That's how disenfranchised and demoralized you are. When you have purpose, it acts as your North Star. So even though you can't see your next step, if you keep heading in the direction of the North Star, it will keep you going because you have motivation, you have momentum, you have direction. And you have a sense of agency because you know you're continuing that journey. So there is a difference between run down and burnout. If you're run down, it's a natural thing to happen. We are humans, we are not machines. And even then, machines need to be recharged. Machines need time to switch off and cool down. But with burnout, the difference is you've lost your sense of agency, you've lost your sense of direction, you've lost your purpose and motivation in life. And which is what makes it really hard, which is why people kind of struggle to even go back to work. Like, why am I doing this? What's the point of me getting up and getting washed in? And that's when it can be very similar to experiencing depression, because you lose that motivation, you lose that lack, that will to live. And so that oftentimes people who end up experiencing burnout also experience depression, myself included. And those who experience depression may also experience burnout because there's a loss of agency and there's a loss of purpose. So it's really important not to conflate the two. It's natural to feel run down. And if you do feel run down, that's when those coping mechanisms are really helpful. Not the defensive ones like it was mentioned earlier, but the proactive and productive ones, the getting good exercise, nutrition, sleep, and all sorts. But when it comes to burnout, that's when you need effective stress management. You need to be able to get out of that fight or flight zone, that survival mode, by putting out the unnecessary fires, put out the house that's on fire. So you then have the capacity to reinstate your sense of purpose, your sense of agency, and your sense of direction so you can go again.
I love that analogy. And, and I don't know, like, how many Starbucks coffees do you need to heal the root cause of your problem, or to like put the fire, out of your house? Because that's what you say, just go for a coffee, see your friends, go to a spa. Yeah, I don't know how many Starbucks coffees I would need to, offset the fire that's going on here. And that's, the one of the toxic advices, which unfortunately is one of those advices that I still see many people who claim to be in this space still sharing.
Yeah, for sure. Being the new kid on the block, I definitely ruffle feathers, because let's go back to resilience, for example. That's often something we see when people say prevent burnout. It's resilience training, be more resilient. Well, there are two glaring issues with that. The first one being that resilience is not an inclusive practice or approach, in that those who have protected characteristics, wherever that may be, are naturally more resilient than their counterparts, because resilience is a natural antidote to resistance. And we all know that if you do have a protected characteristic, you tend to meet more resistance, particularly in the workplace and in general life, than your counterparts. So those actually who have protected characteristics are already resilient. So tending to be more resilient is ineffective. But the reason why resilience is particularly ineffective when it preventing burnout is because resilient people are like the story of the frog in tepid water. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the story of the frog Frogs are really good at adjusting and acclimatizing to their environments. So if you put them in a pot of water and gradually increase the temperature, they'll just keep adjusting and acclimatizing without realizing that the water has got to levels where it's potentially fatal to that frog and they boil alive. Now, with us as humans, particularly as high performers, we are really good at adjusting, acclimatizing to harmful toxic environments, work included, that we fail to recognize when it's got to harmful levels. So instead of being boiled alive, what happens is we burn out. So resilience is completely ineffective and actually makes you more susceptible to burning out, because the more resilient you are, the more stress you can tolerate. The more stress you can tolerate, the longer you will be chronically exposed to that stress. If you are chronically exposed to stress, the only destination is burnout. So I really don't promote resilience for that reason. It's not inclusive, it's also ineffective. And so people say, okay, so what do we do then if we're not going to be resilient? And I say, be tenacious. And then people often ask me, well, what's the difference? And BURNOUT is this. There's a whole saying that when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Resilient people are really good at making lemonade. In fact, they'll make lemonade until the cows come home. They will make lemonade to a point they can fill up a swimming pool with it, and they'll keep on swimming. Tenacious people, when life gives them lemons, because they know life will give them lemons, will stop and say, well, hey, do I even like lemonade? What else can I make with these lemons? But more importantly, is the lemon even worth the squeeze? Just because we're faced with stressful situations doesn't mean we have to adopt and take them on. We need to understand which ones are worth our while, which ones are necessary, and which ones are unnecessary, which ones are acute stress, which ones are chronic stress, and be able to appropriately identify the nature of that stress to see whether it's a fire that needs putting out or a fire where we just need to withstand the heat for a while. So being resilient is going to keep you in the cycle of burnout, which is why creating work-life balance, which increases your resilience, can actually cause you to live in a cycle of burnout. The best thing you can do is be tenacious. When life gives you lemons, instead of just making lemonade, ask yourself, is it worth the squeeze? What else can I do with these lemons?
I love that. I love your stories. I love your analogies. You're full of them. And I'll ask one last question, because I really do want to get through this one as well. There is one question in the chat that I will pick up in a moment, because I think it very nicely ties into this one. And this question was from someone who was asking that, what if it is not us burning out, but someone we care about, or someone who we have to share a home with, and we can't just choose to turn away and not look at them going through burnout. And usually that is, when we want to relieve someone's pain. If it's a relative, we want to take their pain away. If it's a partner, a child's a parent even. And this can get traumatic. So and the question is, how do we show up for that person who might be going through burnout without harming ourselves?
That's a really good question to ask, because, as you said, sometimes it can be unavoidable. And the first point that I would say is never tell that person they're burning out, or that you're suspecting they're burning out, particularly if they're high performers, because burnout is still so taboo. People associate it with failure. And they may just automatically get defensive because you've seen a chink in their armor, you've seen a level of vulnerability or weakness that they may not want to acknowledge or be ready to acknowledge. So it's a case of, depending on how well you know them, if you know there are things going on that potentially are unnecessary stress. So you can see that maybe the house has fallen apart or in disarray, because I think people underestimate the importance of living in a clean and tidy home. Be a case of, people talk about the love languages, acts of service. What can you pragmatically do for them to take some things off their plate, particularly if they're not ready to speak about it? Are there things you can do? Maybe can you pick up their children or look after their children for a while, take them out if the person has children? Is it a case of maybe you can help them tidy around their home if you guys are close enough to do that? Or if there's certain things that they need to get done, offering to do the things just to sort of ease their load, to put out some of those fires for them that they may not be able to see, or that they just can't contain anymore. So sometimes it's the pragmatic steps of support. If that person is ready to speak, it might be just giving them space and a listening ear, not providing solutions in that moment. They might just need to be able to have a safe space to say, this is what I'm going through right now. And then you can say, well, when you're ready, or if you're ready, I'm here to help you in any way I can. and see if there's anything that they're willing to suggest that you could do to help. But oftentimes, the reason why people end up burning out is because they've been in survival mode for so long, they feel like they have to be self-sufficient. So by offering pragmatic help, as I said, picking up the children, maybe taking the dog for a walk or tidying around the house or bring them over dinner one particular evening, just to show them that they're not alone, because burnout is such an isolating experience. It's such an isolating experience. So just showing up for them, but absolutely do not say to them that you think they're burning out. Just try and be as pragmatic as you can whilst protecting your own boundaries, because I'm a huge believer that people need to get from your dividends. You need to invest in yourself so much that the return is so great, you have dividends to give. It's not about giving from your last or giving when you have nothing to give. You need to make sure that it's coming from the abundance, the overflow, that your proverbial cup is running over. So invest in yourself so much. Go to the therapy, deal with the problems, create your own burnout-free lifestyle so you have the capacity to be able to give and give in a way that you recognize is safe for yourself.
Great suggestions. And I think, the pragmatic ones absolutely make sense. If you have the capacity, if you can do that, absolutely do it. Don't offer solutions, absolutely not. Sometimes when you're in the darkest of the dark of burnout, you don't have capacity for that kind of stuff. You don't have capacity to take any, you can just about, get out of bed and do the bare minimums because your body is in survival mode, let alone taking on someone's unsolicited advice. If anything, if the person is talking, just sit with them.
Yes,
sit with them, let them talk, listen, but also don't feel pressured to take that pain away from them.
Yeah.
It is not your pain to take away. It's not your pain to carry. And many of us are already running, as you use the analogy, on empty cups. And it's not about, and we always say, just fill your cup. But you absolutely said right. Oh, the cup needs to be overflowing for you to be able to give. And so it's not about, you fill your cup this bit just so you can give someone. No, the cup needs to be full for you and overflowing for others.
Because if you imagine an overflowing cup as well, there's no capacity for anything else to go into it. So if you had like a cup of water that was constant with the tap running into it, so water's constantly overflowing, you try to put a bit of dye in it, like coloured dye or Ribena or something. Because the water's constantly running into the cup and it's constantly overflowing, the colour of that cup won't change. It might be tainted for a moment. And that's really important, because oftentimes if our cup's not full, then there's capacity, there's space for us to take on things that aren't our own. And then it starts to cloud our own perception of life, which is why it's really important to make sure there's no fire. Your house isn't on fire, because then you can take the appropriate, the measured, the empowered steps you need to help other people without compromising your own health. And it's a shame because we're often, our niceness is often measured by how much rubbish we will tolerate or how many other things we'll take on that's not our own. And actually being nice will make you burn out. And it's something that I've had to learn coming out of my own survival mode, that actually I don't need to be nice. I need to be kind. Kindness is honoring both my boundary and the other person's boundary, and being generous and being present. Whereas being nice, the not having boundaries, the saying yes, the people pleasing, taking things on, is just like carrying a heavy load. Yeah. And that will make you burn out. So don't be nice, be kind. Kind to yourself so you can be kind to those around you.
Thank you for saying that. And as I mentioned, there's a question in the chat that I wanted to pick up as kind of like part of this question. Lilda's asking, what do you do or how do you react when a family member doesn't even understand or denies mental health as such? So someone, I guess, might be already on a burnout and you recognize it, but the person doesn't even recognize that there's such thing as mental well-being. And then and there are those people.
Yeah, especially culturally as well. Like I feel like culturally, generationally, people don't have the understanding. And it's in those times where you have to seek external help. I think sometimes we think, okay, well, this is our community, that we should be able to lean on these people, but actually we need to create our own community who understand our needs. We need to be able to find those people, which is why I say to everyone, like, therapy is for people who don't want to have problems, not just for people who need problems. So whilst it would be great to be able to lead and support of family members, and it is hurtful when they're not able to see what we're going through, sometimes we have to create that external community of either people who do truly understand and have the capacity, but I would say professionals who are trained in that, so that you're not inadvertently being gaslit or in an echo chamber of people who are keeping you within your problem, spiraling as opposed to growing. So it is incredibly hurtful. It's incredibly painful when you're like, I'm here in front of you. Can you not see I'm struggling? In fact, I'm telling you I'm struggling. You still can't hear me. It's incredibly painful when it's within your family. But there are services out there. There are people out there who can help and support you to navigate that as well. Because the more help and support you get outside of there, the less that will have an impact on you, because you'll have the space and capacity to realize, well, maybe that person's hurting themselves. Maybe their ignorance, as in just the lack of knowledge of mental health, is what I mean by that definition of ignorance, just lack of knowledge. It's not actually their fault. They've grown up in a time, or they've grown up in a culture where mental health was seen as a luxury, whereas we know it's not. So the more you actually seek external help from people who are qualified, from people who have the capacity to support and for you to be able to lean on, it increases your capacity to be empathetic to those who just don't get it and don't understand. And a lot of people don't get it and don't understand. Bible, you said yourself, there are a lot of people who work in this burnout space, in this well-being space, who still don't actually understand what it means. So if there are professionals who don't understand, how much more for people in our family who aren't professionals to understand? Even myself being diagnosed with MS, I've got medical professionals who spent their entire career researching MS, still who don't know what causes it and what cures it. I can't begrudge them for not knowing, but what I can do instead is seek other options, alternative options to enable me to get back my health, which is ultimately what I did. To this day, I love my consultant. She's wonderful, but she still doesn't understand why it is after 3 years I haven't taken any medicine. And on top of that, I've been symptom-free for the last 3 years. I'm not going to begrudge her lack of understanding of what I know exists in my world, but I am going to lean towards people who have a similar train of thought and are qualified in order to help me. So that's what I would say. It's incredibly painful. So I see you. I understand that, especially having an invisible disability, which you can say that, burnout's an invisible phenomenon, if you will. I can definitely empathize. But what I will say is, sort of feeling begrudgeful towards them, seek professional help to help you get back onto the strong foundation you need in order to get out of where you are.
And again, what goes through is, don't feel that this is, again, your pain that you need to take on yourself. Because, on one hand is, those people who are kind of like, they might be screaming in their family that they need help, and the family is not hearing. And then on the other hand, the family might be going to them saying, you need help. And the person is just not, again, they just don't hear it. And I have seen it. You're absolutely right. It's generational. It's cultural. On one hand, it's luxury, but on the other hand, I think culturally a lot it is, and also generationally, that it's seen as a weakness. If you even talk about the fact that there is such thing as emotions, full stop, let alone emotional well-being, mental health, however you want to talk about it, there is no such thing. It's only the work that you do that you can see and measure. The rest just doesn't exist. We are just like physical beings, not emotional beings. And I do see that a lot in my own family. I have those people in my own family alone. But what I have learned with my own family, with my friends, is that I can't give them what they're not willing or ready to receive.
100%.
Because if I can say it, and as much as I say it, it's just hot air and just blows out. I might be saying like the best quote, the best inspirational quote, the best lived experience, but if that person is not ready or willing to receive it, it's just in void anyway. So the best I can do is just sit with them, meet them where they're at, let them talk in their own words, in their own language, and simply meet them where they're at. And I'd absolutely show up for them when they're ready to receive it.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, if you've got a bucket, I use water and fire as an analogy a lot. But imagine you had a bucket and you're pouring water into it, but the water just won't stay because there's a hole in the bucket. If that's not your bucket, you can't patch that hole. So sometimes we try to give to people, as Bible is saying, that aren't ready to receive. And what happens is it depletes our own energy resources. We end up getting frustrated. We get emotionally aggravated by the situation, and that disrupts our sense of peace, and it becomes a cause of stress. So there are some people that you have to just love from a distance. And there are some people you have to just love them for who they are regardless. And when they are ready, and you are protecting yourself because you're being kind, not nice, then you can show up and be proactive for them.
And thank you, Sabira, for your time and engagement in this conversation. But there is one more question, but I am mindful of the time, of your time and everyone else who's been with us here already. So instead of kind of like talking about the most, because I think we've covered this question in throughout our conversation, but as a kind of like final takeaway, what would you say is, if you can do one thing and one thing only to prevent or treat your burnout, what would you say? Take this away from this conversation.
True burnout prevention is a lifestyle. You have to create a lifestyle that's burnout preventative, which means it has to be, number one, stress mitigating. Number two, it has to be fulfilling in that it's purpose-led. And number three, it has to be fun. You have to stop existing and start living. 2 extra points that I would say that you should work on right now in this moment, given that we hear talks about recessions and redundancy. Number one, create financial flexibility by becoming debt-free entirely. I mean, all debt bar the mortgage needs to be eliminated so you can have the financial flexibility to respond to any change in income and definitely expenditure with the recession. But also, number two, start creating your professional brand, because the world will decide who you are regardless. So you can either tell them who you are or wait for them to make a decision. And the more you create your professional brand, it quietens down any imposter syndrome you may be experiencing. It increases your confidence to speak up in meetings, to provide innovative and solution-focused answers to questions they've had for yonks. So I'd say do those 2 things. Burnout prevention is a lifestyle, so create one. But 2 things: increase your financial flexibility by paying off all your debts, and create your professional brand because you deserve to have one. The world's created one for you, so take ownership of that narrative.
Thank you. Very pragmatic steps. I love that. And I'll just kind of the last thing say, just echo what you've already talked about, is just be kind. There absolutely will be days when you might have, and you don't have to be at the kind of like deep of burnout where you just don't have the energy to get out or do certain things or look at your long to-do list. Just give yourself permission to just be and be worthy without this toxic narrative that you always have to do and to always have to produce to be worthy, to be seen, and to be valuable. You're valuable and you're worthy just as you are. And it's okay to sometimes just be. And we need to give ourselves permission to do that.
100%. Sustainable success requires rest. There's no 2 ways about that.
Thank you, Sabira. Thank you for all your analogies and your stories and making this conversation so pragmatic, so grounded in facts and in truths, and sharing your experience with so much vulnerability. People are saying thank you. People loved your analogies. And thank you so much for picking up the questions. People saying this is a very important conversation and they've enjoyed being here, and they are wishing us a day full of blessings. So we shall leave on that. So thank you everyone who were here, and thank you anyone who might be watching this on replay. I think this is an absolutely important conversation, an important piece to come back to as and when you might need. Share this. I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of from what burnout is to how to prevent it on an individual level, on a corporate level. If someone in your family or in your kind of close network is burning out, there's a lot that we've covered here. And, Sabira is a qualified, a certified, experienced corporate burnout prevention coach and strategist. So please do reach out to her if you were not necessarily comfortable kind of sharing in this environment anything. Reach out to her in confidence, and she will engage with you and see how she can support you. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you once again, Sabira, for jumping on this talk kind of like last minute. And I'll give a shout out to Martika as well for connecting us, because Martika, my dear friend, was the one who connected us. So thank you, Sabira. Thank you, Martika. And thank you everyone who were here. And until next time.
Bye.